we'll move on to our next speaker, Michelle Sneed, and the title of her presentation is Mitigating Land Subsidence in Coachella Valley in San Francisco. California,
Yep,
sorry.
Yep. It's okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is actually a really cool story. It's really rare that we have sort of a happy ending to a lot of our subsidence studies. And, you know, honestly, when I started working in this area, it's almost 30 years ago, I thought that the subsidence would never end. It would get worse. As I was doing GPS surveys on the side of the road, I would watch water trucks go by and clean the streets 3 times every day. So I never thought that I'd get to tell a happy news story about this area. So the Coachella Valley is in a very challenging environment. It's in Southern California. It's in the Colorado desert. Some of you may have heard of Palm Springs. It's not on this map, but it's just off. It's just right up here. And a lot of people go there for vacation. And so this is a little bit south of that, where we have a lot of cities, a lot of urbanization in Palm Desert, Indian Wells, Indio, if you've ever heard of the famous Coachella Music Festival, right? It's down here in Indio and La Quinta. And then you can see down here there's a lot of farm area. So we have a lot of agricultural use. And, you know, part of the draw of coming down here, and nobody goes here in summer, by the way, you can see it's very, very hot. In fact, the population drops by something like 50% because the rich people that can have 2 houses have one, and they come here in the winter to enjoy it, and then they bail out in the summer to go somewhere cooler where it's not as hot. And we've been out here during GPS surveys when it's been 126 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't even know what that translates into centigrade, but it's ridiculously hot. But people love to go here and golf. There's 120 golf courses in this area, very high density of golf courses. It is a destination. Hardly gets any rain, right? So this is a very challenging environment. There's not rivers here. There's the Salton Sea down here, but it's more saline than the ocean. So it is not used for water supply. And in fact, it's starting to shrink already. They're going to have new problems besides land subsidence in terms of air quality here pretty soon. So just a quick look at the hydrogeology. It's really, I'm going to be talking mostly, about the Indio subbasin. This is kind of in the pink salmon color. That's where we've done most of our work. We've actually just barely started to look into this Mission Creek subbasin here, but today I'm going to be talking about the Indio subbasin, unconsolidated to semi-consolidated assemblage of alluvial and lacustrine deposits. There's more clay in the southern part of the valley, and that's because of an ancient lake during Pleistocene times. It was called ancient Lake Cahuilla, and it came as far north as Indio, and in fact, this we could kind of call it a remnant, but this is actually an engineering accident, which is why there's water there now. So there's more clay south of Indio because of that ancient Lake Cahuilla, and also it's further from the mountains. So there's, you know, the mountain runoff comes down here in the Whitewater River, and you know, only the fines survive that far south. So it's a little bit finer grain down there. There's lots of folds and faults here. So this is sort of the infamous San Andreas fault system, runs on the east side of the valley here. And it does cause some flow barriers and just sort of defines these groundwater subbasins, including Indio and Mission Creek and the others. It's a thick aquifer system, about 600 meters thick. The northern valley, right, because it doesn't have those lacustrine deposits, is kind of a semi-confined aquifer system. It is quite coarse-grained, but as you get deeper in the system, those clay lenses start to confine it more and more. And the southern part of the valley is really semi-confined and confined aquifers. Those lacustrine deposits confine that lower aquifer system, which is the most productive aquifer system in the valley. So that's where they like to pump from. So groundwater, right, because it doesn't rain and there's no rivers, groundwater's been a very important part of the water supply in the valley since, you know, since it's been developed, since the late 1800s. About 30 meters of water level decline in the past 100 years or so. And for decades and decades and decades, there was annual overdraft. Water levels got deeper every single year. And that's why I thought I would be working out here forever. And we haven't stopped working out there yet, but I'm starting to see kind of the end, as I'll explain here in a minute, because the last time I reported to this group about this area was 2010, and we didn't even know this was coming. So everything kind of changed in 2010 for a variety of reasons. And I'll explain how they did this in this very challenging environment. They had projects that not only reduced demand on groundwater, but also increased recharge to the aquifer system. And they got all the sectors of water users involved. And it's really it's a model for how things can be done in environments like this. So I just took a few hydrographs. There's uncountable wells out there. There's so many. So I just took 3 wells to show you the hydrograph throughout that Indio subbasin. And you can see it's basically the same no matter where you are. You know, the elevation is different because this is a very, this is a low desert. And so much of it is below sea level. It's not too far from Death Valley, actually, in Southern California. And so you could see that there are all these declines in the northern valley, in the central part of the valley, in the southern part of the valley. You can see in the southern part of the valley, there was actually an increase for a while. And that was because they started to import water from the Colorado River. And so there was decades of decline. And then as they imported the surface water from Colorado River, water levels came up, but then, you know, people kept moving there. And so demand outpaced supply again, increased groundwater pumping, and you can see groundwater levels decline for decades and just got, every year, they were lower and lower and lower. And then as you get to around here, you start to see a change. And it's not the same everywhere. Here, Northern Valley was a little bit later. You know, Central Valley around 2009 maybe was the low. And here maybe a little bit sooner, 2008, where you start to see that inflection in groundwater levels where they started to come up. So the problem out here, right, there's been about 0.7 meters of land subsidence, which, you know, is nothing compared to Mike in Texas with 10 to 12 feet, and I'm going to talk about like 40 feet on Thursday. So these are pretty small amounts compared to a lot of areas, but it's the differential land subsidence, and I've heard that mentioned a few times today in other talks, that really is, you know, is really what causes the damage to homes and infrastructures, particularly in La Quinta. There really hasn't been damage reported in other areas, which has been kind of surprising. But there has been damage to homes in La Quinta, and here's a couple of pictures up here, just cracked sidewalks, offset curbs. And then here's that canal that brings Colorado River water to the area. And it was getting lost capacity, lost freeboard. And they actually rerouted part of this canal to try to avoid the area of subsidence, but they didn't do a very good job. They should have rerouted it a little bit different. But, you know, they did what they did. They spent the money, and so it's done. And here's this is from 1948 when a fissure opened up out in La Quinta, which was the first indication that there was something going on out there. So way back in the day, they didn't know. It was after a big rainstorm, so they weren't sure what was going on. But, you know, as we learned later, as we collected more data, realized that it was probably subsiding before that. But it's been surprising that we haven't seen damage elsewhere reported. So we've thrown a lot of data at this area. Like I said, we've been working there for almost 30 years now. We've done a lot of interferometry, of course, right? It's our bread and butter as for measuring subsidence these days. And as I'll show you, you know, this is the only method that showed us, you know, why the extent of subsidence was stopping in certain areas, right? We had found some geological control using interferometry. We've also been doing static GPS surveys out there for a long time. I keep thinking the cooperator is going to say, okay, we've had enough, because they're really expensive to do, but they kind of like the GPS surveys. So at first we were doing them every couple of years, but honestly the subsidence rate was too slow to get out of the error bars. So we told them, stop spending money, stop spending money all the time on GPS surveys when we're not really getting good information out of them. So started spreading them out a little bit, and one was just done a couple of, like a month, I guess last month, that we don't have the results from that yet. There's been about 17 to 24 benchmarks per survey, kind of depended. We actually used INSAR to locate new benchmarks, to build new benchmarks, right? Kind of can use INSAR to design a ground-based monitoring network, so we use that there. There's also some continuous GPS stations out there that we use to validate the INSAR data, and also to validate our GPS surveys. And then, of course, the oldest data was spirit leveling, which we really don't do anymore. So the occurrence of subsidence, as I'll show you in a minute, is really limited to the west side of the Coachella Valley, despite similar groundwater level declines, essentially valley-wide. Right, so that tells you, okay, the effective stresses are probably around the same, right? Same water level decline, so there's some change in geology that's causing sort of localized subsidence areas. I'll show you the northern subsidence extents in Palm Desert and Indian Wells area is abruptly terminated. And so we, did some research and found some structural reasons for that, geologic structures reasons for that, and I'll show you that. And then the third area of subsidence, La Quinta, the eastern subsidence extent is somewhat controlled. So here's an interferogram, and this is a stacked interferogram for a really long time, but it's got huge gaps, something like 8 years of gaps in these things because of just interruptions in satellite data availability. But you can see here those three areas that I just mentioned. So there's Palm Desert, Indian Wells, and then La Quinta down here. Also on this map, I show some replenishment facilities. So these are engineered ponds that when water's available, they put the water in the ponds, let it infiltrate into the aquifer system. This one up here has actually been in use since the 70s, but it didn't really do anything for subsidence down here because up here is much coarser grained, and any replenishment of the water here was basically drawn into pumps by the time it got that far south. But you see another one up here. The one I'm going to talk about the most is this replenishment facility down here. This has made a big difference, and I'll show you the results of that. Okay. So around 2010, right, water levels began to stabilize, and areas stopped subsiding around that same time. The few areas that did continue to subside were subsiding at a fraction of the rate. Indicating, a mixed aquifer system response, right? Because we had increasing water levels, but still continued subsidence. So we had some residual compaction going on. So just a quick look at these three areas. So in the next three slides, the water level is always in the dark blue. The land subsidence is always in the brown. And you could see, here how, right, very linear. Well, we had a gap here. We also had a gap here, but we felt pretty comfortable estimating it, right? Because the rates before and after that were so similar. But here, everything started to change, so we didn't estimate that gap. Here you also see that the extent of subsidence is abruptly terminated by this fault, which is not visible at the surface at all. It's in alluvial. Moving to Indian Wells, you see the same basic pattern, and also for La Quinta, the same basic pattern. The only difference is the fault here doesn't really cut off the subsidence totally, indicating there's some, and we know that there's more clay down there, right? Whereas in the upper area, there's not as much clay. And this, by the way, is that canal, and you can see it goes right through the Subsidence area that brings Colorado River water up. So the mitigation was really effective and timely. So they involved agricultural and urban water users, so everybody in the valley was involved. Three things. They did groundwater substitution. So any non-potable uses, they brought in Colorado River water and recycled water and took them off of groundwater. So that was golf courses, irrigation, and other non-potable uses. And then conservation. So this is where they get those rich homeowners, right? Your first 100 cups of water, those are going to be, $3 a piece. That 101 cup of water is going to be much more expensive. So that really controls their use. And then the managed aquifer recharge, that Thomas E. Levy recharge facility raised groundwater levels in some of the most overdrafted parts of the valley. They're building more in other parts that are still slightly subsiding. So they were doing this before the passage of the Groundwater Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that stipulates that you can use groundwater however you want, but you can't cause undesirable results, which includes groundwater level declines and subsidence. And so this is the mitigation strategy, and you can see the timing of these things. Just for your reference, so there's purple, red, green, and pink wells correspond to the colors up here. And here you can see in those overdrafted parts, right, you could just see this thing turn around right here, right where all these actions happen, getting all the water users in the valley involved. And that's just a summary of what I've already talked about, and I know I'm probably over, so I'll quit there. I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, Michelle. I got a question because I know you're a big proponent of multiple ways of measuring land subsidence. And I'm wondering, if you had only INSAR out there, what kind of difference would it have made in the measurements of subsidence? Did you wind up having to correct a lot of that based on the GPS surveys you did?
Yeah, so the GPS surveys were the earliest indication. We had GPS surveys before we were doing INSAR out there. And honestly, the cooperator didn't believe, when you tell people, oh, we can see, millimeters of change from space, they're like, don't believe it, right? So they wanted us on the ground doing these GPS surveys. It took them a while to convince them. I mean, they're believers and, they're fully bought in at this point. They're still paying for the GPS surveys, which I'm a little unclear why they want to do that, because they're expensive, but, we do what they want us to do. And it does make for a nice validation measurement. And you never know when satellites go down. I mean, and that was how we thought back in the day. There's so many choices now and more coming online all the time. So that was a big worry. And always has been with water agencies, is they're worried about long-term data sets. They need to know what's happening in long term, not just for a few years here and there. And so I think that was part of it too.
Thank you, Michelle. Great presentation as always. I was wondering if you know how it works, this recharge program in not in shallow sediments, but in deep sediments, fine sediments. Does it actually work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Right, so you can't just build recharge ponds wherever you want, especially when you're pumping from the deep system. And that's how you see that they're on the edge of that valley, so that they're sort of getting right down to that base system, by putting it right in the foothills right there where that clay isn't really built up, in the center of the valley. You couldn't put those in the center of the valley where it's really thick clay, where that lake was just sitting there during the Pleistocene. Yeah, so you got to be really careful. I'll talk quite a bit more about that also on Thursday for another area in California. Thanks for the question.
I have just one more question for you. You say that you involved the urban and rural water users. What does that process look like? How do you raise awareness?
Well, the water district essentially just wanted to hit, they're really proactive. I mean, this is a water district that, they were looking into these issues before anybody made them look into these issues. Now it's a law that they have to look into it. But they figured, all of those water users are pretty big. So it's not, it's not that one water use is, oh, maybe we can let them slide. I think they wanted buy-in from everybody in the valley that, look, you're a part of this, and this is a desert environment, and we all have to contribute to trying to get off of groundwater.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for your really nice talk.